From a distance, a country can look stable right up until it isn't. Flags still fly.
Officials still issue orders. Courts still stamp paperwork. Soldiers still hold their posts. But stability is a surface condition, and revolutions do not begin on the surface. Revolutions begin when ordinary people quietly stop believing the rules are protecting them.
Not when a crowd storms a building, but when daily life turns into a grind that feels permanent. And when the people who govern look insulated from that grind, that is the real beginning.
Pressure that lasts long enough to change belief. If you strip away the slogans, the heroic portraits, and the dramatic turning points, many revolutions follow a repeatable sequence, not because a single mastermind wrote a script, but because incentives under stress repeat. Fear repeats. Survival politics repeats. Institutions under strain tend to break in similar places. You can think of it as a 6-stage cycle. Pressure builds, legitimacy breaks, polarization hardens.
Dual power emerges, consolidation is enforced, and then fatigue produces a new normal.
The cycle is not destiny, but it is a map. It helps you recognize when a society is moving from stress into rupture. Stage 1 is pressure. Pressure is not just poverty. Pressure is strain that cannot be solved with normal adjustments.
It is the moment when small fixes stop working. Pressure can come from debt and fiscal weakness.
The cost of war, crop failures, corruption that feels untouchable, or rapid social change that outpaces institutions, or a widening gap between what people expect and what the state can deliver. Pressure is what makes people brittle. It turns a normal shock into a breaking point. Pressure is first felt in routines, in kitchens, in markets.
In wages that no longer stretch, in rent that rises faster than work.
In the sense that even a good week ends with worry. When pressure lasts, it changes how people interpret everything else.
A price becomes a signal. A tax becomes a symbol. A shortage becomes a verdict.
When pressure is chronic, rumors spread faster because people need an explanation for why the system feels like it is failing. And the longer the strain continues, the more leaders face a trap. Reform early while credibility still exists. Or cling to control and hope the stress passes. The longer they wait, the narrower their options become. In late 18th century France, pressure was not a single cause, but a convergence. The state carried heavy financial burdens.
And the political structure was rigid. Society contained deep inequality across estates. For many households, the price of basic necessities mattered.
In a way that outsiders often underestimate. When essentials become unstable, daily life becomes political before politics becomes violent. People can endure hardship, but they have trouble enduring humiliation without explanation.
Stage 2 is the legitimacy break. Legitimacy is the invisible foundation of a state.
It is the belief that authority has the right to rule, and that obedience is meaningful even when decisions are disliked. When legitimacy is strong, people obey with complaints. When legitimacy weakens, obedience becomes conditional.
When legitimacy breaks, the government can still exist on paper, but it no longer feels inevitable.
It becomes negotiable. It becomes challengeable. Legitimacy breaks when institutions cannot provide basic stability.
Or when their decisions signal indifference. It breaks when elites appear insulated while everyone else absorbs the shock.
It breaks when courts, administrators, or councils look captured or self-protective. It also breaks when leadership looks incompetent.
Detached or trapped in its own rituals. The key is not only performance, but perception. A state can survive mistakes if people believe it is trying and adapting.
But when people believe the system is failing and indifferent at the same time, trust collapses quickly. In France, once fiscal weakness and political paralysis became visible, Suspicion spread. Every decision looked self-serving. Every delay looked contemptuous. Every reform looked too late. That is the brutal dynamic of a legitimacy break. Even correct decisions can be interpreted as manipulation because trust has evaporated. And once weakness is visible, it becomes contagious. The system is still standing, but it is standing on disbelief. Stage 3 is polarization. When legitimacy breaks, the political space does not stay empty. It fills with competing stories.
Moderates argue for repair. Reformers argue for redesign. Radicals argue that the structure must be replaced entirely.
Reactionaries argue for harsher enforcement to restore order. Polarization is when compromise stops looking like maturity and starts looking like betrayal.
It is when language becomes absolute. It is when opponents stop being wrong and start being enemies.
It is when every group believes time is running out, and when delay feels like a kind of violence.
In France, polarization accelerated as the crisis widened. Once the old rules were publicly questioned, they could not be unquestioned quietly. That is a point of no return many regimes fail to recognize. A society can tolerate hardship.
But once it learns that alternative rules are possible, it becomes difficult to return to silent acceptance.
Hardship becomes moral. Administration becomes morality. And moral narratives mobilize people faster than spreadsheets ever could.
At that stage, politics becomes not only about resources, but about who is allowed to decide and whose dignity counts. Stage 4 is dual power. Dual power is the moment the system becomes unstable on the ground.
Official institutions still exist, but alternative centers of power begin to make real decisions.
Dual power can appear as assemblies acting like sovereign bodies, local committees organizing supply, militias enforcing neighborhood order, councils distributing food or policing streets, or crowds deciding what laws mean in practice.
Dual power is when the old regime can still speak, but cannot reliably enforce.
And the new forces can enforce even before they are fully legalized. This is why dual power is a tipping point. It turns politics from argument into logistics. At dual power, the crucial questions become concrete. Who controls the guards? Who controls printing and communication? Who controls food distribution? Who controls transport routes?
Who controls the streets after dark? Power is no longer only the text of law.
Power is the ability to make decisions stick. When people experience authority in daily life, the system is no longer one referee. It is multiple enforcers competing. France's revolutionary arc shows how quickly dual power can convert
daily life into a contest over the machine of society. When official authority hesitates, local authority grows.
This is why dual power often produces rapid escalation. It is not just that people believe something new.
It is that new structures begin to do the work of governing, and once they do, they become hard to dislodge without force.
Stage 5 is consolidation through force. When two powers compete, one eventually attempts to settle the contest.
That settlement often arrives as emergency measures, crackdowns, purges, civil conflict, and centralized enforcement.
This is the stage most people remember because it is vivid and frightening. But it is not the beginning. It is the middle, when the struggle for control becomes physical and the definition of enemy expands.
Consolidation through force does not always occur, because everyone wants brutality.
It becomes more likely because instability rewards the faction that can act decisively, discipline its own ranks, and punish challengers. Fear expands in this stage, and fear changes definitions. Enemies are not only those who attack you. Enemies become those who resist, then those who hesitate, then those who question the pace. then those who are merely suspected. That is how emergency politics grows, not as one decision, but as a chain reaction. And once emergency politics dominate, the cost of returning to moderation rises sharply because every side believes surrender means destruction.
Stage 6 is fatigue and a new normal. People cannot live forever in emergency.
Eventually, the population demands predictability again. And predictability often arrives through centralization.
This is the stage where revolutions become systems. Slogans may remain, symbols may remain.
But the structure hardens. A new bureaucracy forms. A new elite consolidates.
A new normal replaces the old one. Revolutions often end, not when the last speech is given,
but when the system becomes boring again. When institutions feel permanent enough that people stop imagining alternatives every morning.
This is the 6-stage arc as a map. But the map becomes clearer when you compare two different societies.
Under different conditions, and watch the sequence rhyme. France is one classic example.
Russia is another, separated by more than a century, with different institutions.
Russia's empire looked immense from the outside. Vast territory, monarchy, court ritual, military tradition, long habits of obedience. But pressure rose under the surface. Industrialization created new urban workforces and new tensions. Rural hardship remained deep. Political repression narrowed peaceful channels for reform. In the early 20th century, Russia had already experienced turmoil and reform attempts that did not fully resolve underlying strain. That matters, because revolutions rarely come from nowhere. They come from unresolved pressure that accumulates. Then war intensified everything. War multiplies pressure. It strains budgets, supply, and morale. It breaks households. It produces shortages and casualties that seep into every street and factory. War also forces urgent decisions while reducing the state's capacity to deliver stability. In that environment, the legitimacy break can accelerate. People begin to believe leadership cannot protect them. And once people stop believing the ruler is competent, obedience becomes conditional, then negotiable, then collapsible. Polarization follows rapidly under those conditions.
Some groups want constitutional reforms, others want deep social transformation, others demand harsh restoration of order.
In crisis, moderation struggles because compromise feels like delay, and delay feels like collapse.
Coalitions become fragile, factions harden. Messaging becomes more absolute because absolute messages coordinate faster. This is a quiet rule of political breakdown. The more time feels scarce, the more politics rewards simplicity over nuance.
Dual power becomes visible when alternative councils and organizations begin acting as real authorities.
When official commands matter less than what can be enforced locally. When legitimacy becomes a reward for controlling streets, supplies, and discipline.
In revolutionary environments, legitimacy is not only a philosophical argument. It is enforcement plus belief.
If you can keep transport functioning, keep food moving, keep workplaces organized, you gain legitimacy.
If you cannot, you lose it. This is why revolutions can accelerate unexpectedly once dual power emerges.
People are no longer debating a future. They are experiencing competing governments in the present.
In 1917 Russia, the collapse of old structures and the rise of competing authority centers produced instability rather than immediate calm. In that scramble, organization matters. Groups with clear chains of command and coherent messaging can move faster than broad coalitions.
That does not mean their goals are universally supported. It means they can act decisively while others argue.
This is one reason revolutions often drift toward hard consolidation after the break. Not because everyone becomes extreme,
but because extremes coordinate quickly under pressure. Then consolidation through force becomes central.
After a state collapses and before a new state becomes secure, conflict spreads. When enforcement is contested, politics often becomes about survival. Emergency measures, crackdowns, and centralized control become tools of consolidation. This phase is harsh not because everyone woke up wanting harshness, but because instability rewards those willing to impose order with decisive methods.
Once stability becomes the supreme good, enforcement becomes the path to legitimacy.
Then normalization arrives as a structure hardens.
A new elite forms around new institutions. The old elite is removed or weakened, and the revolution becomes routine. Again, the cycle does not guarantee freedom. It guarantees change. What comes after depends on who controls logistics.
Who controls enforcement, and whose story becomes common sense. When you place France and Russia side by side, the details differ, but the sequence rhymes.
Pressure builds, legitimacy cracks, polarization accelerates, dual power emerges, force consolidates, fatigue produces a new normal. This is why revolutions can feel designed when you watch them later. Not because a mastermind engineered each step,
but because incentives under stress repeat. When survival feels threatened, identities harden.
When trust collapses, simple stories spread faster. When enforcement weakens, local authority grows.
When chaos expands, people accept harsher consolidation. When exhaustion arrives, people accept stability.
The most dangerous moment in the cycle is not necessarily the final crackdown.
It is the early legitimacy break, when institutions still exist but trust has evaporated. At that moment, reform is still possible, but reform becomes politically expensive. Every reform looks like admission of guilt. Every delay looks like contempt.
Leaders can become trapped by the need to appear strong. In that trap, they often choose symbolism over delivery.
And symbolism without delivery accelerates collapse. The second tipping point is dual power, because it creates a competition of enforcement. If the official state cannot enforce, challengers gain space. If challengers can enforce, they gain legitimacy.
And once legitimacy becomes a reward for strength rather than for law, the character of politics changes.
It becomes harder to restore a single center without coercion, because the ground has already learned to obey someone else.
Revolutions are also narrative machines. The old order tells a story about continuity, tradition, and stability.
The new movement tells a story about justice, dignity, and renewal. In crisis, the story that best explains pain spreads fast.
But stories alone do not move a country. Logistics does. Food supply, fuel supply, transportation routes,
payment systems, communication channels. When a regime loses control of logistics, it loses control of reality.
That is why boring institutions matter.
A revolution is not only a contest of ideals, it is a contest for the machine that keeps daily life functioning. When that machine stops being reliably managed by the old order, people do not simply protest. They replace management.
If you want to recognize the 6 stages as signals instead of labels, watch for markers.
Pressure looks like chronic strain, rising costs, widening distrust. Legitimacy break looks like open disbelief, public mockery of authority, refusal to comply.
Polarization looks like camps hardening, compromise shrinking, language becoming apocalyptic.
Dual power looks like parallel institutions enforcing rules, rival patrols, competing authorities.
Consolidation looks like emergency governance, crackdowns, and centralized enforcement. Fatigue looks like public demand for order and acceptance of a new normal that might not match the revolution's earliest dreams.
France did not transform in a single day. Russia did not transform with a single takeover.
Both became long processes of reconfiguration. That matters because people often imagine revolutions as moments. In reality, revolutions are sequences, incentives tightening stage by stage. Each stage changes the incentives of the next. Pressure makes legitimacy fragile. Legitimacy collapse makes polarization explosive. Polarization makes dual power likely. Dual power makes force attractive. Force produces fatigue. Fatigue produces demand for a final stabilization, which becomes the new order.
This also explains why revolutions often produce outcomes that surprise their early supporters.
Many people join early for reform. Then the collapse accelerates, and reform becomes insufficient.
The system moves into emergency, and emergency rewards hardline organization.
The cycle does not guarantee liberation. It guarantees a reallocation of power.
So the most practical insight is not cynicism. It is timing. If a society can reduce pressure and restore legitimacy early, it can avoid later stages.
If it cannot, later stages become more likely, not because of fate, but because stress and incentives push it there.
That is why historians watch budgets and bread prices, not only speeches. Why political scientists watch enforcement and institutions, not only elections.
And why revolutions are often preceded by long periods in which everyone senses something is wrong, but no one agrees on the fix. When someone says a revolution came out of nowhere, translate it. It means warning signs were treated as normal until normal broke. France showed how quickly palace confidence can dissolve into street authority. Russia showed how quickly imperial tradition can dissolve into parallel power. Different centuries, different languages, same structural logic.
And the final question is not, can a revolution happen? The final question is, which stage are we already in?
Because once dual power appears, options narrow. And once force becomes the language of politics, the cost of returning to calm becomes enormous. 6 stages. 1 recurring arc. A reminder that history is not only about heroes and villains.
It is about systems under strain, institutions responding to stress, citizens responding to uncertainty.
And what fills the gap when the old order can no longer carry the load. Revolutions are not random storms. They are sequences that begin when pressure overwhelms legitimacy and end when exhaustion demands a new stability. The uncomfortable twist is that the new stability can be just as controlling as the old one. The cycle does not guarantee freedom. It guarantees change. What comes after depends on who controls logistics, who controls enforcement, and whose story becomes the new common sense.
If you want to understand the cycle, don't start with the riot. Start earlier. Start with pressure.
Watch legitimacy. Listen for polarization. Look for the first signs of dual power. Because once the machine reaches that point, the rest of the sequence becomes easier to recognize. And that is the value of the 6 stages. Not to predict exact dates, not to reduce history to slogans, but to see the risk map beneath the headlines, and to understand what replaces a system when control begins to slip.